we're now going to add an additional layer and modify our material and rock material further. What I want to do is use a portion of the procedural terrain within the function in order to control a new material that we're going to create. And what I want to use is the blend. What we have is our blender between the square samples and the square patterns. So we're going to add an output custom dependency connected to that blender, and we'll just call this rocks. And then we'll just set up the mapping within the material. So we can go ahead and close that out, click OK. OK again, and go into our material, our rock material. We're going to add a new layer. Under rocks, in the rock collection, we're just going to select the default material to begin with. And we're going to call this, actually we'll call it rock overlay. And we're going to give the entire material a name as well. We'll just call it rock peak. Okay, so our rock overlay, we're going to start by changing the alpha boost to 0, changing the highlight size to more dull to begin with. And we're going to go into the function for the color. And I'm also going to set up the material preview. We can copy the color map, because I like the darker color map in the background, and just paste it in to that background. We'll set it to terrain. Go ahead and switch that up to 100 meters. Close it out. Edit the function. And we'll go ahead and set our preview options in here to terrain as well. What we're going to do is replace this with color brightness variation. Go ahead and set our color to somewhat what it's like right now. Kind of that peachish sort of color. But with the variations, it'll be slightly different. Increase the noise variation, decrease the color a bit, bring down saturation, and just kind of adjust our noise scale, and then connect our color to that. Looks like we will need to increase the noise scale. And then we're going to add in an input node, external dependency. Go to our procedural terrain and select the rocks. We're going to map it, so we're going to add a filter, map, and connect that to our external dependency. And what we're going to do is set the output range to -1 to 1, or lower value -1, upper value +1. And in order to set our input range, we're going to set our lower value to 10, and I think our upper value to 4. What we can do is go and select the link just before the map, and just kind of take a look at that. And we might be able to bring it down maybe to 3.5, maybe even lower. We could do -9.5 and just bring it in a little bit more. So we can connect that to our alpha, and we're just going to have kind of a strip going over some of the areas. The way it's going to be defined is going to be more of a harsh line, so we're going to end up mixing that with a fractal to kind of subtract from it. So let's just take a look from a little farther away so we can see the current material before we go and make any changes. Gives you a better idea of what you're working with. Just a smaller render, but it'd be enough to see that new material layer. At the moment, I think the colors are a little too similar. Also because of just the way our lighting is set up. They don't really appear to be all that different. So we're going to brighten it up a little bit, go into the color, and I am going to pick a lighter color. I'm also going to set my scale to 1 and just make sure that all of the scales are set to 1. And we are working in the world standard mode. So that's going to lighten it up, and we're going to start to see that a little bit more. I'm also going to set it to clip the out of range values back in the map filter. And I think I will actually set this and give us a little bit of room, just setting it back to the -10 and the 4 because of the subtraction we're about to set up. It does look like I need to go back to my noise scale now that we've changed the overall scale. Increase our contrast a bit. We're going to go to highlights, and we're going to increase the highlight to about 60. Go to the effects tab and take our contrast and set it down to 0.5. It'll round up to the nearest percent. The 0.5 is still entered, but it is going to display 1%. Now, if you did want a more obvious representation of where the material is, if you're having trouble because the colors are very similar, you can use the highlighter. So if we go ahead and click on this, we can see it has that red overlay. So now when we take a look at the material, we're going to see right now it's pretty much overlaying throughout the entire material because we're not really cutting it out or cropping the range. We could do that by modifying the map. Maybe bring that down to 0, and then we can start to see which areas are going to be affected by the overlay. For now, I'm just going to bring it up to 4 because I am going to do a mix, which should hopefully remove that. Otherwise, we can change the map back. What I want to do is set up a blender, or a combiner node set to blender. We're going to add a fractal node. Depending on the complexity you want for this, you could use a grainy fractal for a very complex. Terrain fractal is also very complex. Or we could use a simple fractal. I'm going to start with a simple fractal and see if that's going to be enough. We're just going to adjust our largest feature. Let's go ahead and set that to 3 meters, and our metascale to 16 meters. Our roughness we'll set to 0.65. The direction that the landscape is widest on is basically the if we take a look, we can see it's really moving along the x-axis. So what I want to do in the material, or in that fractal, is increase the x to 3, and then I'm going to take the z and bring it down to 0.5. Or actually, bring it down to 0.25. We can increase actually the roughness maybe up to 0.8, make it really rough. So now we'll connect that to our blender, and we're going to set that to the minimum mode. So min, the ratio of 1, and it looks like we will need to go to that map filter and bring that down to 0. And actually, if we move it over to the max, it might work better. The material preview we're seeing in the output observer is slightly incorrect. It's not really showing us our output from the terrain. So we kind of have to take a look at the render and see. So I am just going to set that. Yeah, it does look like it does need to be on the max. And maybe I can bring back that 4 Maybe not. Let's just do a quick render with the highlighter on and just take a look at the areas. We'll probably end up reducing the scale of the fractal, and if it's not enough, we can just move it over to maybe a grainy fractal. That does look like a pretty good distribution. I'm probably going to go to our fractal and just modify the gain a bit. See if we can get it to subtract a little bit more. Maybe bring down our metascale and largest feature. We'll go ahead and set the largest feature to 10, and we'll set the metascale to 16, and bring the gain down to 2. And that should be good. Okay, so we can turn off the highlighter just by clicking on it again. And we should start to see a better overlay on the terrain. And I think I want to saturate that a little bit more. You can see it, and what we're primarily seeing, which is a really nice way to blend materials, is the difference between the highlight amount and the contrast amount. That type of alpha overlay is really powerful and a great way to add variation without having to set up an overly complex function. Obviously, it is possible to do and create this within a single material layer, but it's not always necessary. So this way we can very easily have just 2 separate layers. I'm going to go to our color brightness and increase the saturation of this overlay so it is a little more yellowy orange, so towards a red hue, and maybe just a tiny bit more. So that's looking a lot better now. The next thing I want to do, and we don't have to do this within the function editor, we can very easily achieve this within the environment tab. We're just going to go to the environment tab and we're going to change the slope range so that this material is only appearing on steeper slopes. It'll give us a nice look to the cutoff, and that way the flatter areas are still going to retain the other material, and then just on those steep slopes we'll have this overlay showing up, which is going to give us some really nice patches. We're going to go ahead and set the slope range. We'll bring it up to 55, and I've got the fuzziness amounts set to 2% right now for both. Okay, so the distribution now is looking a lot more interesting. What I want to do next is just go to the highlight. We're going to increase the highlight, but we're going to set a variable highlight and connect that. And I think that this simple fractal really doesn't give enough detail. At least not with the Perlin noise gradient. We'll go ahead and set this to terrain Perlin noise. I'm going to go to edit. And let's just set it to a value double noise. And then we can modify the billow or ridge. Adjust the smooth area altitude. Add some distortion. That should be good. And we'll go ahead and connect our highlight to that as well. And because we may end up with this falling outside the range of what is showing up because it's connected to the same as the alpha, what we can do is use absolute wave, brightness of 1, contrast. Actually, we'll do a brightness of -1, contrast of 2. And that should be good. I do want to have a bit more darkening of this material as well. So what I'm also going to do is add in a color map, and we're going to set that to just be black and white, and then connect that to that fractal, add in a combiner node, blender, and I'm just going to subtract a little bit. So let's do 0.26, and maybe 0.3. So just subtracting from that to make it a little bit darker in some areas. So that's starting to look better. I do want to go back to the base layer and make one change. Going to the rock, highlight, editing the filter, and what I'm going to do is bring that point on the right down to -1 on the Y. And we're going to just kind of chop this out a bit. And just set our lowest points to -1. And that should be a little better. The highlight was a little intense where it was showing. Going back to the rock overlay, with that subtraction, the color doesn't quite look right now, so I'm just going to do a little tweak. And it looks like I went too far with some of them. I'm going to change the color variation, saturation, and just use the brightness a bit. Another thing that can be really interesting for this is if we take another blender and another color map of black and white and connect it to that external dependency, but to the map. And I may need to invert it, but what I want to do is just multiply and darken it. And then actually we'll set that to 0.5. And we can create another map or a threshold, another filter in between to make it slightly different if needed, if it's going way too far out of bounds. Or we can just go into the color map and let's bring in the black a little bit. Set another white key point. So we could just type 255 all the way in and just kind of bring that down a little bit. So that'll make it a little more different. Maybe 0.56 for the multiply. And then going back to the material, the rock overlay, I am going to increase the highlights just a little bit more. And then I'm going to go to the alpha boost and just set it to about -7. So it's going to have a little bit of an overlay and kind of show the material underneath. But not by much. If it's getting too dark, we can lighten it up. So if we want to go into the material, and we can go to the color brightness and add more brightness variation and a little more contrast. Because once we start multiplying a little bit lower, we're starting to get things a little too dark. And I do like the blend, but I did originally want to have something that would stand out a bit more. So I am going to lighten this up. And maybe take the alpha boost and bring it to -3. And if we go back to where the alpha is being mixed, what we can do is maybe modify this fractal, and keeping in mind that it's going to pretty much modify everything else connected to it. We'll go ahead and bring in a bit of the stretch damping. Increase our gain a bit. Maybe go to that color map where we multiplied it and bring that black part down. Or bring the black part up, delete the white part, and maybe just set this to an add at 0.2. Okay, so another thing we could do, just one last change, would be to go into the material, and when we were setting the alpha, we went and clipped it. The original number we had was the upper value of 4, which gave us an overlay that was much larger. I'm going to go ahead and bring that back to 4, and we can take a look. Because now that we have the slope range, it shouldn't cover as much. And it does look like it's covering maybe too much now. So we could tweak it a bit more. Maybe bring it to 2. And then go to our environment, maybe set the slope range to, say, 62. Because it is pretty steep. And I just went ahead and set the gamma down to 1 as opposed to 1.8. And you can see a lot more change between the materials when the gamma is a little bit lower. So even if you're not seeing it as much at 1.8, knowing that when you switch over that it is more apparent is kind of reassuring to know, because the scene itself, when it's properly lit, you'll be able to pull out all of those different highlight ranges. And if you bring it into post, or do any post-processing even in view or relighting, you'll be able to get a lot more out of the material. So I just want to move our camera around a bit, and we can take a look at it from a different angle so that we can see how the lighting is behaving with the highlights. Okay, and if you don't like the way that the fractal is modifying these edges, if you want something that's a little more strata-like, what you can do is turn down the roughness, because we do have the roughness up really high. So if we go ahead and set it down to 0.5, and maybe take our wavelength up to 5. That should improve that a bit. And we'll go ahead and set the Z to 0.1618. And that looks a little better. It might need a scale change, or that might just be coming from the external dependency from the terrain fractal. So maybe a little more tweaking, trying with some other different fractals in order to get it, if you don't want those kind of blobby look on it. I kind of like the way it looks. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that the way it is, and I'll render out a larger version so that you can see the final material. I'll probably have a couple of different versions available. A couple of different angles, maybe lit differently, either ending up within the content of the training or on the website, if you want to take a look at those. But we'll go ahead and render one out right now, a little larger, and just take our focal length. I'm also going to go ahead and save it first to Rocky Landscape E05 Material 4. So here's the render of the material. Just got a couple of post-process effects on it. So if I turn off post-processing, this is what it looks like without any post, with the natural film response on, and then having the gain and density modified along with the color perspective. I think if I was to work on this a little further, I'd probably modify that alpha a little bit, maybe cut it out more, maybe even go back to that original 0 value for the upper amount on that map, and just cut it out to be sort of those strips that we had before. Those lines look like they probably need maybe a little bit of work, but I think for the most part it turned out pretty good. So you can go ahead and load it in. Take a look at it if needed. If you maybe had trouble following along with certain parts of the training, feel free to load the scene in and reverse engineer the material. Overall, I think it turned out pretty well considering how minimal the function is. It's not a very complex function. I've created some that are far too complex, probably overly complex, and that's one thing. Probably one important thing is to make sure you just don't go overboard adding nodes, because sometimes you end up creating an entire set of nodes that really kind of overwrite each other, because it's just way too complex and half of the function's not really even in use or noticeable. So probably some of the best advice I can give is just don't overdo it, because it'll take a lot longer to render, and obviously can take a lot more time that might not be necessary. So I'll go ahead and save out another copy with just the post, and I did make one or two slight changes here or there. So I also, just one last note, want to mention, because it is connected, or at least that secondary layer, the top layer that we added in, that kind of strip and lighter layer, is connected to the internal fractal of the terrain itself. We can use the randomize and generate different terrains, and we should still be able to get a nice secondary layer detail that's going to match the new seed, the new vector location. So I'll just render just that out kind of small, because I'm not going to be saving this version. And that turned out looking pretty cool. Go ahead and turn off the post-processing so you can see the full range. And it looks pretty neat. So all of that is going to be connected. You can save out this terrain as a preset to generate new ones. In order to do that, in case you're unaware, you can edit the object and save. So if you have a procedural terrain, you can save it out, and that's going to be a PRT file, a procedural terrain file. And then you can save it in your procedural terrain directory or infinite terrains. This isn't an infinite terrain, although it could be converted to one. And then if you want to load in a terrain preset like this, you could right-click on the function or procedural terrain, and then you can see a list of the terrains in your library.